Hello and welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and I'm delighted to be here with my friend Salah Zalatimo, who I've known for years. He was a consultant at McKinsey. He's been the chief digital officer at Forbes, and he now is a co-founder of Oobleck Partners, which offers digital transformation consulting services. Salah, welcome to the show.
Hi, Will. Thank you very much for having me.
So, Salah, let's talk about magazines and digital transformation. And maybe you can start with a bit of a history of magazines.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Yes, my favorite topic, transformation and media. As you mentioned, I was the chief digital officer at Forbes for about 5 years, and I led a pretty invasive digital transformation at the publisher. And I think to even be able to begin to talk about that, it might be helpful to just do a quick little background on the whole magazine business, just to set the context. So you can imagine, magazines have been around for a while. Forbes itself was founded over 100 years ago. And what's interesting is that many of the most well-known magazine brands today were also founded around 100 years ago. Why is that, you may ask? It's because much like every kind of startup trend, generally there's an underlying technological innovation that enables new businesses of a certain type to launch. So if you can recall, within the past 5 to 10 years, we had the D2C boom. So all these direct-to-consumer brands were popping up, and what made that possible was social media and performance marketing on social media. So you could literally go find the specific individuals that might want this new all-natural brand of toothpaste, and you can target them and sell directly to them and have a really good ROI measure on your marketing spend, which enabled all those businesses to launch and flourish. So, in a similar sense, around the turn of the last century, printing became cheaper, and more specifically, the paper and ink used to print got cheaper, which made it possible to print a weekly magazine and sell it for a price that consumers would be willing to pay for it. Prior to that, sorry, printing was generally expensive. And so, as we all know, the first book that was printed was the Bible, and it kind of went down from there in order of kind of gravity and seriousness and importance until we get down to literally comic books. So, when that innovation came about, a bunch of entrepreneurs went out and raised money the same way that tech entrepreneurs go to VCs today, raised money from investors and launched new magazines. One of those individuals was a gentleman by the name of B.C. Forbes, or Bertie Forbes, and he launched a magazine around the Great Depression, actually, or just before the Great Depression, and it's what we know as Forbes today. So if we go back in time and think about that business, what he launched, and I'm sure what his pitch was, well, I'm going to create a magazine that is targeting ultra wealthy, successful business people, and we will be able to sell them subscriptions, and they will buy the magazine to read about their peers, and we will be able to sell advertising to all of the brands that want to get in front of those wealthy individuals. And that is exactly how the business was run for about 100 years. If you think about the components of it, what you essentially have is an editorial team and a sales team. And everything else that was needed to run the business was secondary or tertiary. And in traditional business terms, you can call them cost centers. So you have a business that's been run by, largely driven by the sales organization for a very, very long time, and the tension between in that company was trying to maintain journalistic integrity and separation. Well, then cue the internet, and all of a sudden you don't have to print anymore. And so, for the first time in 100 years, this business was confronted with a technological innovation that greatly changed the way that business needed to operate. And so we saw a lot of magazines go out of business in the past 20 years. We've seen a lot of companies make the adaptation. Well, not a lot. Very few of them actually made the adaptation and thrived because it really changed the way that the magazine business needed to operate to continue to be successful, and that wasn't very obvious to everybody involved.
By
You
the
with me
way,
so far? Yeah.
I am with you, and I will just mention in passing, we're really talking about digital transformation, but just for a little history, I just finished reading in the fall The Publisher by about Henry Luce, which is about, is a biography of him, but largely, talking about the magazines that he launched. Of course, Time Magazine, Life Magazine, Fortune Magazine, and Sports Illustrated. And it is what you're describing exactly. It was very much like venture capital today when Luce launched it when he was like 24, 25 years old with a co-founder he knew from Yale. And it was like the scene that they describe. It's all these young kids just graduated from Yale, like scrappy, raising funds from their friends and family uh, to get this thing going. Untested people, early days of magazines. There was magazines that had been like late 19th century, but fascinating history. And so I am with you so far. I recommend The
Okay.
Publisher for someone who's interested in a good kind of story about the history of magazines.
I'm happy to hear you just read that. I've known about the book, but I haven't read it myself, and I will check it out. Yeah, I find it really, really, I found it interesting to learn about how, essentially this concept of I got an idea, I'm going to raise some money and start a business, uh, felt very tech to me growing up. Like I thought this whole concept of VC investing and startups was just a very modern new thing in tech, but it's literally been happening since back in the day. And I think the first ever venture was like expeditions, and even Christopher Columbus was very similarly raising money for a venture that he promised huge returns on. So anyway, with that context being set, then cue in the technological change of the internet, and well, now we have not only new distribution channels, we're going to have to hire new people, have new departments. We also are going to have to figure out new ways of making money. And so I started my career in 2001. I graduated college in 2001 from Columbia, and I very quickly was drawn to the digital media space because when I got to university, it was, I lived that experience of getting the first ever broadband connection in my life and learning about Napster and about music. And it wasn't so much about it being pirated or free, it was about it being comprehensive. Every possible song ever was now available to me. It was just a wild idea. And I could click a button and have it instantly. And it really made the concept of a CD or an album feel so weird all of a sudden. And so I was one of the founding members of the Bertelsmann Music Group's digital music team. And at the time, and this is 2003, at the time, we were reporting revenues of ringtones and things like that. For I think total revenues the first year was about $1 million globally. Well, by the time I left, Bertelsmann then merged with Sony, and by the time I left Sony, it was about 2009, and the revenues in the digital business were about $1 billion, if I recall correctly. So you can imagine we had a 1,000x growth. So when I first joined Forbes in about 2016, when they acquired my startup, Camerama, I walked in to a company that from the outside was widely held as one of the most successful digital media companies with regards to adapting to the new business models of digital media. And so what I learned after walking in, though, was that the adaptation was essentially outside in. What I mean by that is there was a gentleman by the name of Louis Dvorkin who had founded a digital media company about 10 years prior called TrueSlant. And he had, very accurately predicted the shift in content creation away from traditional newsrooms and journalists to more freelance and independent journalists. And so he had built a platform where writers would write articles and actually get a revenue share on the content and what was generated. And what this did was that it aligned the incentives of all the stakeholders in the content creation process. So the writers and the publishers were all trying to generate more revenue, and therefore you were paid based on the success of that content. Well, Forbes acquired that company and adapted that business model to their own company, to their own newsroom, and overnight, well, not overnight, it took a few years, but they went from having a few hundred in-house journalists to having several thousand freelance journalists. And by doing that, and by doing that on a rev share basis, they were able to do it without much financial risk in terms of paying for that content. Of course, there was definite risk in terms of whether the newsroom would accept it, whether advertisers would accept it, whether readers would accept it. But they really bet the farm on it, and they were not just right, but they were very right, because around the time that they started producing significantly more content was also around the time that the Google algorithm was maturing, and the way that Google algorithm worked, unbeknownst to many at the time, is that it's a link sharing or a link back system, and inherent in that is that once you develop kind of a lead in SEO, it's very hard to lose that lead if you continue doing what you're doing. So Forbes is one of the first out of the gate to dramatically increase their content production, and that dramatically increased their SEO, and it literally left everyone in their dust. And there's essentially no real chance of anybody displacing them at this point. So by kind of rapidly expanding the size of their content creation engine, they created a real behemoth from an SEO standpoint, and that's where the majority of audiences were coming from. Google is the first place; it's the front door of the internet. Similarly, with Facebook, they benefited from doing similar as well, which was by having all these writers. Those writers also had their own social media accounts and their own audiences, and so there was just this virtuous cycle that was developed, and truly put Forbes ahead of the curve from an adaptation standpoint. So that's the context that I walked into. Now, all of that sounds amazing, and it sounds like, okay, well, why would a company like that need digital transformation? Well, to put this kindly, I mean, it was, I was walking into a room of hamster wheels with hamsters on it. So they were outwardly delivering what the tech platforms needed, which was a lot of content and frequent content, and what audiences wanted, which was, content that covers all topics and that is delivered in the channels with which they are active, meaning Google and social media. But it was being done in a very manual, kind of old school way, which meant that there were thousands of freelance journalists being managed by full-time journalists. And there was a traditional sales team out trying to sell magazine ads in a print magazine when the majority of their content and audience was coming through digital, through these freelance contributors that they didn't even have any editorial oversight over. So entering, so kind of that's the stage. And so I'll pause there to see if you have any questions or any clarifications before I get into the actual work that we then did.
Yeah, I do. So how did it work at that point? If someone wanted to be a writer and post their stuff on Forbes, was there a vetting process? Was there editorial review before stuff got published? Could people just sign up and publish whatever they wanted? And how did the payment to the person work? Did they get paid based on some revenue share of the ads that were served on their post, or was it just purely volunteer? I'm curious how that whole thing worked. I have seen people, in their LinkedIn bio say Forbes contributor, and it seems kind of impressive, but from what you're saying, just anybody who wants to, it's like saying I write on Medium or something, just anybody who wants to can sign up.
But you're asking an extremely important question, almost the question. And so the tension that arose from the adaptation of this new content creation model was between the traditional journalists and these new freelance journalists. And so in order to be able to do what Forbes did without running the legal liability of somebody publishing something either factually inaccurate, libelous, or illegal, or to have some illegal content in it, the newsroom would want to be able to review the content and make sure that it's within the law and also meets the Forbes standards. However, if Forbes was to review each post and potentially edit a post before it went up, they would then assume all legal liability for anything in that post. And so if you're familiar with the way social media platforms work and their regulatory environment, they maintain zero liability for the content on their platforms specifically because they do not review it before it goes up, meaning it is truly user-generated content, and they are simply the platform with which that content's going up. They don't have any influence over what that content is. Their responsibilities are to quickly act to remove anything that's harmful and illegal, especially if they're alerted to it. But it having been posted for some period of time before being acted upon is not their liability. So for Forbes to do this, they had to also tell their newsroom that, hey, and not only are we going to have all these freelance journalists writing content on our website, we're not allowed to review it or edit it. Now, you can imagine for an editor-in-chief, that's blasphemy. That's impossible. Like, how could you possibly allow unreviewed content up on our site when our own journalists have to go through several rounds of copywriting and editorial before it goes up on our site? But these freelance contributors are free to do what they want. And so the way that this was mitigated was to say, all right, well, what we'll do is we will heavily vet them before they're allowed to publish. And we have the right to terminate our relationship with them if they're doing things we don't like. So we will have a really aggressive filter up front for who gets to write on the platform, and we'll take action after the fact if they do something wrong. However, within those two things, we're kind of hands off. And so it was a tough pill to swallow for sure. And I think there's probably people in the newsroom that are still not happy with it. But that is, when you say, like, is it just like Medium? It's definitely not just like Medium. I would say it's more of a exclusive or curated version of Medium, in the sense that, yes, you can publish what you want, but to get the right to do that does take, there is a high bar for that. And if you step out of line, you're probably going to lose your right to doing that pretty quickly.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. And how did people get compensated? Was it just purely volunteer so they get the exposure, or did the contributors get paid based on, how popular their posts were or something?
This is, to me, the genius of what Louis Dworkin had developed for TrueSlant, which Forbes then acquired. The genius of it was that it aligned incentives. And right now, if I was to give you a one-sentence explanation as to the problems with digital media today, the whole business model, the number one problem is misaligned incentives. I think this is true for all forms of digital media. If if we step away for a second and just think about the fact that digital advertising is the primary way to monetize digital media today, there's a lot that comes connected to that, and that implies quite a bit about how you're going to operate your business. And if you're a traditional newsroom where your focus is on journalistic excellence, breaking stories, covering stories, making sure it's well researched, fact checked, all of that takes time. Well, that is very disconnected from what is actually driving digital media revenue. Digital media revenue is driven by page views. Page views are driven by clicks, and those clicks come from Google or Facebook. And you have to be able to, if you think about, where your content is now competing for attention, it's in somebody's social media feed. So you got to compete with the content that's above and below it, and you better have some really compelling headline to do that. And so we know, the example of BuzzFeed, and everyone knows, the listicle craze, the viral listicle craze that kind of went on, when BuzzFeed first launched, because they correctly identified this gap, this disconnect. Like, digital media is not getting much traffic because their content is just juxtaposed with other social media kind of, lighthearted or, kind of brain sugar. It didn't compete, and it couldn't break through. And they found a way to do that. So what TrueSlant and then Forbes had done was they said to the writers that, well, we make money based on the number of page views your content gets. So you will also make money based on the number of page views your content gets. So what they did there was that they incentivized their writers to optimize their content for these new distribution channels like Google and like Facebook. And I would say primarily for Google. And so what they were able to do, the best writers were able to kind of, in a sense, maybe through A/B testing and maybe not that formal, but like just over time, identify what patterns led to more page views. And so they started doing things like, picking certain times of the day to post things, using specific words in their headlines, the order of the words in the headlines. They started, following trends online for ideas of what to write about. And so it dramatically changed the way that Forbes had worked, and it's what enabled them to actually dramatically grow during a period of time where all other digital media companies were either losing money or going sideways.
Okay, amazing. So enough of my distractions. Let's get back to your main story. Talk to me about the digital transformation.
All right. So what I walked into was a newsroom full of journalists who looked overstretched, whose jobs, many of them had shifted from writing long form pieces to managing freelance writers, managing quotas of freelance writers. And, we have to recruit a certain number a month. Those writers need to generate a certain number of articles a month. Those articles need to generate a certain amount of page views a month. And so it was really impressive to me as a data guy to walk in and see such a KPI driven operation. It was also abundantly clear that we had a room of journalists running business operations that really had little to do with their traditional job function, which was writing stories. And so that created a lot of, I would say, well, a bit of chaos, but I would say it created a lot of stress because it was people clearly doing things that they may not necessarily have been trained for, maybe isn't what they signed up for. And it was a lot of learning on the fly. And so there was a tremendous amount of manual work being done where, as a technologist, it was quite clear to me that a lot of the stuff could be simplified, automated, and just made more consistent and more flexible. And then on the other side of the house, the sales side of the house, you can tell that they were still struggling with, their whole careers were made selling, large print advertising packages to luxury brands. And now the majority of the revenue was coming from digital ads, many of which were being filled by programmatic networks and by third parties. And so there was a real, it felt like this behemoth was moving forward and plowing forward, and it felt like the organization was, kind of the SEO was pulling the organization forward in a sense, there was a lot of room for rethinking and reprocessing, especially by integrating technologies. So the first thing we looked at was, well, we know that the primary driver of this business is content generation. We know that the brand requires content quality to remain high. And we know that there's a room of journalists managing several thousand freelance writers in a very manual way. So we looked at the publishing platform as the first opportunity for improving not just processes but outcomes. Now, if you're familiar with publishing platforms, the most popular or most widely used one is WordPress, but it's really meant for kind of smaller publications and smaller outfits. Excuse me.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Umbrex uses WordPress, and it's sort of the most common for small, medium-sized business kind of thing, right?
Exactly. And so when I walked in, I was shocked to see that Forbes was using WordPress, and they had built on top of it a tremendous amount of customization that was being held together with bubble gum and duct tape and was breaking constantly. And as you can imagine, the stress that is created in an already stressed organization when the publishing platform itself isn't working or goes down or makes a mistake. So it was a high stress environment, um, doing things really inefficiently. And so our goal was to try to improve the platform to make things run smoother and make people's lives better. Like hopefully, and it was there wasn't that much fun being had when things were going well. It meant things were more stressful, and so it was hard to even celebrate and enjoy success. So what we did was we looked at the platform and we evaluated all the possible options of other third party platforms. And after going through it all, we realized that Forbes and its unique business model really there wasn't anything in the market that would fit what it needed well, but there were lots of components available in the market that we felt we could stitch together in a with a similar amount of effort in as having customized an existing full platform, and it would also allow us the capability of going beyond what is traditionally used in other word publishing platforms. So specifically, we were thinking about AI and automation, machine learning. When I look at 3,000 writers for Forbes writing hundreds and hundreds of articles a month, to me, that's data, and that data has insights in it, and I want to use them. I want to find them, and I want to use them for something. And so, first thing we did was hire some data scientists to start poring over the data that we had in terms of content, in terms of the performance of it, and beginning to look for insights and patterns that might be helpful to us, to the writers, to the newsroom managing the writers, and to the development of this new platform. Well, I mean, it was one of the most fun periods of my career because we were able to find out things like, these three words put together in the headline have a 40% higher ranking in Google than comparable synonyms. We were able to find that placing the image after the first paragraph dramatically increases completion rate. We found other insights like that were fascinating and impactful that really mattered. I would say that my favorite insight of all was we developed a proprietary link share tracking system that we called Views, viral early warning system, and we developed a model that could predict with 95% accuracy whether an article would go viral, and that prediction would come within the first 15 minutes of it being published.
That's crazy. Just based on the reactions of the first people who saw it and whether they engaged with it or so forth, or what was it based on? That's amazing.
It was so cool. I mean, so one of the things that I've took away from the Forbes experience is quite a deep understanding and expertise in just URLs and URL structure and just kind of how URLs and parameters in URLs work. So one of the biggest challenges that a publisher has is first-party data. We depend on all of our platforms to come up with data, and so one of the things that we didn't have at the time was any connection between the different the different platforms and sharing. So if you shared something on Facebook, somebody got that link, then shared it on Twitter, then somebody got that link and sent it via text message, and then kind of that chain follows. You lose all of that. You can't get that information. So the first thing we did, the first ever first party data collection that Forbes ever did, was this viral early warning system. We called it Views. And so we'd put a custom code in the URL that was specific to that page view. So anywhere that link went, that parameter stayed with it. And so we could track sharing across platforms for the first time ever. Now, that allowed us, why does that matter? It matters because when you share that link to two people, that's a good sign that something is popular. But if you share that link to 4 people, that's a good sign that it's going to go viral. And that third and fourth person very often is not on the same platform. That's you getting it and texting your mom, who texts her cousin. It goes that way. And so by doing this, we were uniquely able to find out very, very quickly with high accuracy how well something was resonating with our audiences. And that enabled us to then focus all of our firepower on the highest likelihood to succeed articles. And so the impact of that was actually quite dramatic and quite clear. And it pretty much we were then able to create bots that were scanning all content at all times, looking for the certain patterns that we had identified using these algorithms. And anytime it would find it, it would automatically post it to social media. And not just social media, it would automatically post it to the platform with which we felt would be the most successful for that piece, because all platforms had different success rates for different types of pieces. It was truly amazing. Our social media activity, our team remained about 6 people or so at the time, but the amount of throughput went through the roof. We opened up a bunch of new accounts, social media accounts for specific niches and specific topics, and they were all populated by what we found to be deterministically the most likely to succeed on those platforms.
Wow, that's very cool. So you'd have something like Forbes, marketing account, or a Forbes, strategy account for something. So you'd be giving specific content to follow that bot, people who cared about that topic.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we went from there into, okay, well, now let's see. We now have, that was, I would say, us trying to figure out how to make more out of what we have. The next front was, how do we get more? And so we started looking at, looking at the same data set of our content and the success metrics around it. We set out to develop a new publishing platform. And within that platform, we began introducing machine learning and AI tools to help improve the quality and the reach of our writers' content. So we actually coined an AI editor by the name of Birdie.ai. Actually, the publishing platform is called Birdie, and the AI elements in it were kind of in Birdie's voice. Birdie being BC Forbes, the founder of Forbes back in about 100 or so years ago.
Right.
And so we started with things like, when you write a headline, it would give you a headline score, and we could determine what would work better or worse for a headline. We could determine the length of your article, if it could be optimized, longer or shorter, placement of images, complexity of the content. We looked at all of the available AI APIs, publicly available ones. We also developed some of our own based on the data that we had developed to introduce that. And I think what we were confronted with a pretty interesting challenge, which was that the way that we first built our MVPs of these were not very well received by our newsroom. And it was truly a fascinating experience in not just trying to implement new technologies, but trying to change mindsets to be able to adopt those new technologies. And when we first showed the power of these tools that we built, where you can write something and it can improve your headline, suggest a headline, suggest different word counts, suggest topics to write about by looking at trending topics, the newsroom really reacted poorly. And after discussing with them and doing rounds of focus groups and interviews, what we then came back and tried to do was, instead of implementing or integrating these AI tools, we tried to integrate them kind of in a more, what I would call, an Apple sense, meaning like they were fluid, and it would just kind of, as you were doing what you would normally do, writing your headline, it would suggest new things. You type in your headline, it would suggest keywords to use in the body. We thought that was like kind of an elegant, fluid way to do it. But what we found was it felt like the computer was telling them what to do. It felt like the computer was doing their job. It felt like computers are going to take our jobs, and kind of that hysteria a little bit was tapped into. And so by changing the way that we expose these tools, and instead of making them like fluid and organically appearing, we made it push button and by request, like, hey, please tell me what you think about this headline. And it gives you suggestions and you can just dismiss it or implement them. It it let the writers feel like they were back in control and that the computer was truly there as a tool for them to use if they so felt, as opposed to being pushed on them. And that small change made all the difference. And we were able to introduce all of these features, and people were able to turn them on or off. And instead of it feeling like this was competing, it felt like it was empowering. It felt like this was making them better at their jobs. And so it was the beginning of a much more efficient way to not only manage these writers, because you can build in the quotas and the KPIs into the platform and they can get suggestions, reminders, etc. So you didn't need people running around sending emails and trying to get people to deliver on deadlines. But we also were able to optimize pieces so that we were getting the most reach possible without much manual intervention needed.
Very cool. What are some of your kind of closing takeaways or tips for someone who's thinking about doing, preparing for a similar kind of digital transformation?
I think the key thing for me, and I say being able to do this within a newsroom is one of the more challenging environments to be able to try to do something like this. And so I walked away with a lot of really empathetic takeaways, meaning like, understanding that this isn't just you optimizing how something is written, but this is you changing somebody's livelihood and changing something that they've been doing for a long time. And, it's easy as a technologist to get very excited about the technology. And I'm like a real data nerd. Like I love that stuff. When the data is telling me something's real, I, it must be real. And, it's not that simple. And so kind of maintaining the human element of this all and coming at it from a much more empathetic standpoint, I think would have allowed us to move a little bit faster and would have saved a lot of kind of stress along the way. And so my advice to anybody tackling a similar type of digital transformation in their companies is to really lean into the people that you're going to be affecting by it. Make sure that they're part of the process early on. Be considerate about the words that you use and the choice of words. Like us calling it AI powered versus AI assisted, versus AI enabled. Those things really do matter, and will dramatically impact your chances of not just implementation but integration.
What strikes me as so interesting is how it was a fairly subtle tweak to make the people feel like they had more control over it, rather than kind of by default pushing the suggestions out, like letting people request it. Just giving them that sense of agency made such a difference. That is a fascinating takeaway for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you look at digital transformation as a way to make individuals better at their jobs versus digital transformation as a way of making an organization more efficient, you will be far more successful if you focus on the individuals. And I think you're exactly right. Increasing somebody's agency is an awesome thing. Taking their agency away is a terrible thing. And just based on the positioning, it can feel the same thing can feel one way or the other.
Salah, thank you for joining today. For listeners who want to follow up and perhaps reach out to you, where can they find you online?
Yes, you can find me on LinkedIn. You can email me, salah@ublek.xyz, and on the Umbrex website as well, of course.
And we will include those links in the show notes. Salah, thank you for joining.
Well, thank you so much. I always love talking about data and digital transformation, and thanks for giving me the forum.